Welcome to Night Chemistry, your candlelit refuge beneath the stars. Here we mix gentle science with soothing storytelling to guide you into restful sleep. Tonight's journey is a detective mystery tale entitled The Case of the Cobalt Mirage. Find a comfortable position, soften your breath, and let your thoughts dissolve like mist in moonlight. Prologue, the blue flame at midnight. The botanical garden had always been a place of quiet refuge in the city, a sealed-off world of damp soil, rare flowers, and the faint hum of greenhouse vents. By day, it bustled with students, researchers, and tourists seeking the perfume of orchids and the symmetry of palm fronds. By night, however, the gates were locked, the pathways dark, and the great Glasshouse stood like a cathedral to forgotten hours, silent and still. That night, however, stillness was a lie. The air was heavy with the late summer warmth that never quite left the streets after sunset. A thin veil of mist clung to the cobblestones outside the garden, wrapping itself around the iron railings and the twin lion statues that guarded the entrance. The moon hung low, a muted silver coin in the sky, clouded with haze. From somewhere far off came the dull hum of a passing tram, but here, among the narrow shadowed lanes, the world felt suspended, waiting for something to happen. Inside the Glasshouse, the darkness was not complete. The faint glow of sodium lamps, left on low to protect certain fragile plants, bathed the interior in amber, casting lattice shadows through ferns and vines. High above, the curved roof of glass reflected this dull light in warped panels, a patchwork of gold and black. The air was warm, humid, thick with a mingled scent of earth, wet stone, and the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine. It was precisely at midnight that the change came. A sudden ripple, not a sound but a sensation, passed through the greenhouse. For the briefest instant, the temperature seemed to drop. From the heart of the orchid section, where rare and delicate specimens were kept under glass domes, a point of light flared into being. At first it was no more than a spark, a firefly's glimmer. Then, in less than a breath, it erupted into a flame, but no ordinary flame. The fire was cobalt blue, pure and impossibly bright, like molten sapphire. It burned without smoke, without heat, and most disturbingly, without touching anything. It hovered in midair, spinning gently, a twisting spiral of light that cast ghostly reflections over every leaf, every pane of glass. And then the visions began. The night watchman, a man named Ellis Price, who had worked the garden's night shift for 12 years without incident, would later swear that the moment he saw the flame, images flooded his mind. Not dreams, not memories, but something between the two. A child's laughter in the street he didn't know, the scent of an unfamiliar ocean, a door opening to a room filled with stars. For others, the visions differed. A pair of gardeners, working late in the propagation wing, claimed they saw entire landscapes materialize in the air, a frozen desert under two suns, a forest whose leaves dripped liquid silver. All agreed on one thing. The experience was intoxicating and deeply unsettling. The flame held for no more than 6 seconds. In that span, time seemed elastic, stretched thin and brittle. When it vanished, it did so in silence, collapsing inward like a trick of the eye. Ellis found himself standing alone among the orchids, his lantern raised, his heart pounding in his ears. The air smelled wrong, sharp, metallic, almost electric, the kind of smell that lingered in the nose after a lightning strike. He touched one of the nearby glass domes and found it cool, though the greenhouse was warm. His fingers came away dusted with a fine, iridescent powder, blue under the lantern's light. He took a cautious step forward, scanning the ground for any sign of fire damage. There was none. The wooden benches were unmarked, the leaves unscorched. Yet when he exhaled, he swore he could see his breath, as if the air itself had cooled in defiance of the greenhouse's climate controls. From somewhere outside, the faint chime of the old City Hall clock reached him, 12 slow, deliberate notes, marking midnight. The sound seemed louder than usual, each strike echoing in his chest. Ellis felt a prickle along his neck and turned sharply, certain he wasn't alone. But the aisles were empty. save for the long shadows of palm fronds swaying gently in the artificial breeze. He stood in the stillness for a long moment, the hairs on his arms raised, the scent of metal refusing to fade. He should have reported the incident immediately. Instead, he lingered, pacing the greenhouse with slow, deliberate steps, hoping to find the source. Each time he passed the orchid section, he caught the faint shimmer of blue along the glass, like moonlight on water, though no moonlight reached us deep inside. When the morning shift arrived hours later, they found Ellis sitting on the steps outside the Glasshouse, lantern extinguished, his uniform damp with humidity. He spoke little at first, only muttering about a light in the air and pictures in my head. But when the curator heard of the strange powder and the persistent haze clinging to glass, he made a quiet phone call. By the time the sun had burned through the morning mist, the city's most unusual investigator had already been roused from his sleep. Arthur Langley, chemist, forensic analyst, and reluctant seeker of the inexplicable, was on his way to the botanical garden. By evening, the case would have a name, and the cobalt flame that burned without burning would become the first step into a mystery no one in the city could have imagined. Chapter 1, Glasshouse Ghosts. Arthur Langley arrived just after dawn, when the garden paths still held the night's moisture, and the first visitors were nothing more than crows testing the iron railings. He signed the curator's ledger with neat, unhurried strokes, accepted a ring of jangling keys, and stood for a moment studying the greenhouse from the threshold. The old glasshouse rose like a ribcage in the damp lawns, arched panes held by blackened iron, beads of condensation trembling along every seam. Inside, amber safety lamps pulsed a steady heartbeat. Mr. Langley, the curator, a narrow-shouldered man with a wool tie that had lost the will to lie flat, hovered nearby. We've kept the doors sealed since the incident. Air handlers are on low. Nothing else has been touched. Good, Arthur said. Let's keep it that way. He glanced at the brass plaque. Palmer Conservatory, 1893. Have your staff accounted for everyone who was present at midnight. We have names and statements. Ellis Price found it. He's shaken. Let's let the scene speak first, Arthur murmured. He clicked open the leather latches of his field case, an orderly art of tweezers, wipes, microvials, sorbent tubes, and a palm-size meter with a hinged probe. No hat, a dark jacket cut close, and a tie loose in one respectful notch. He looked less like a detective than a researcher on his way to a lecture he'd give from memory. He slipped on nitrile gloves and nodded at the curator to turn the key. The door yielded with rubbery sigh. Warmth lifted over him in a slow, fragrant wave. Wet soil, fern breath, the faint musk of orchids, and beneath it an intrusive note metallic and cold, like a coin pressed to the tongue. Hold the door, Arthur said, and knelt to remove a small, sticky pad from his case. He pressed it lightly to the threshold metal, then to the rubber gasket, sampling for contact residues where fingers inevitably wandered. Into vials went the pads, labeled with small, careful script. He took 3 steps inside and stopped. The Glasshouse, so carefully curated to feel like a jungle, was a precise machine. Zones of humidity, pockets of temperature, duct air that never quite stirred the larger leaves. And yet the air felt subtly wrong, as if a draft moved where no vents aimed. He watched the thin strand of Spanish moss at the edge of a bromeliad shelf. It drifted one way, then back, as though deciding. Light broke on the panes in pale sheets. Under certain angles, every pane wore a faint, bluish sheen, as if someone had exhaled a breath of frosted air and it had frozen into a film. Arthur took out a small handlight and clicked to 365 nanometers. The violet beam cut across the nearest pane, and the blue haze responded at once. Not a garish fluorescence, but a whispering, diffuse glow, an afterimage that seemed to persist a heartbeat longer than the light deserved. He moved the beam slowly. Wherever it touched, the haze brightened and then relaxed, as if it remembered. He said mostly to himself, not soot, not salt efflorescence. Something deposited, thin, even. The curator hovered. Is it dangerous? Most things are, Under the right conditions, Arthur said lightly. He unclipped a PTFE swab, misted it with solvent from a dropper, and drew a precise square on a lower pane, careful to keep the pressure constant. The swab went to a vial. He repeated the motion on a second pane, higher, stretching just enough to confirm what he suspected. The film was everywhere, but faintest near the floor, densest halfway up the wall, as if whatever had settled had preferred to linger at a certain height, around human chest level. He crossed to the orchid section where the midnight flame had appeared. If witnesses could be trusted, the orchids watched him with unblinking, floral eyes, coaxial patterns, and impossible colors that felt like nature's attempts at mathematics. Under one bell jar, a slipper orchid bore a lip the color of bruised sky. On its glass, the blue haze was stronger, visible even without the lamp. He lifted his meter, flipped open the probe, and took an air reading. Baseline humidity high, as expected. A slight, localized uptick in ozone. A curiosity, given the garden's usual strictness about UV sterilizers. Volatile organic compounds hovered above typical plant emissions. The meter sketched a restless line, as if its tiny mind were unsettled. He crouched, steadying his arm against the bench, and watched his own breath. Nothing visible, yet the air retained that paradoxical coolness, a suggestion around the forehead and wrists, the body's barometer noting the slight. The blue haze, the metallic tang, the cool, a trio that didn't belong in a tropical wing. Arthur clipped the sorbent tube to a miniature pump and drew a measured sample, then sealed it. He swabbed inside of a bell jar where the haze was thickest, then tilted the jar and sniffed gently. The metallic note sharpened, but in it, something else now. A faint bittersweet ghost of glue or varnish, the smell of a studio rather than a jungle. He straightened. "Your lamp's sodium vapor?" he asked the curator. "Yes, low intensity overnight. They shift to full spectrum at 10. Any UV systems?" "Only in the quarantine wing. And off at night." "Good." Arthur's pen moved. Unexpected ozone. Possible corona discharge? Surface plasma? He looked back up at the glass roof. Mornings after storms sometimes left charge that made the hair lift along the arms, but the night had been dry, unless the charge had been made here. Footsteps approached, cautious. A man with a lantern in callous hand and a uniform cap in his other, not on his head. Ellis Price. Surely. He kept to the aisle as one does around the wounded. Arthur nodded. "Mr. Price, I'm Arthur Langley. I hear you were the first at the scene." Ellis swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing. I heard something. Not a sound, exactly. Like a twist in the air. Then the light. Blue, sir. Pure as a flame on meths. Only it." He gestured helplessly at the space above the orchids. It didn't touch anything. Heat. Didn't feel any. Felt colder, if anything. Like standing in the shade at noon. And there were pictures. Not like ordinary seeing. Like remembering something I never did. "What did you do after?" "Look for scorch. For broken glass. There weren't none. I touched one of them jars. Cold as a window in January." He rubbed his fingers unconsciously. "Got that blue dust on me. Washes off. But you never quite stopped smelling the coin of it." Arthur's gaze softened. "And since then, dreams, sir. Not nightmares. Just busy. Too much to hold." Ellis looked ashamed by this softness, as if admitting that a light had moved and made him less sturdy. "Sorry." "No need," Arthur said. "Our senses are instruments. Sometimes they're played." He took a small adhesive patch from the case. "May I?" "Wrist, please." He pressed, lifted, sealed. "Skin oils and any residue would speak later." "And your lantern from last night?" "Here." Ellis unhooked it from his belt. Brass, polished by years. Arthur held it at an angle, the lens, too, with the faintest of blue veils. He swabbed its rim and the brass collar, where heat would have baked off anything uncommitted. The haze persisted. Stable, then at gentle warmth. Interesting. The curator cleared his throat. "Mr. Langley, there's a security feed. It's not much, low light, but you can see when Ellis goes in. There's a bloom." Arthur followed them to a small office tucked under a stair. The monitor, built to withstand a gardener's hands more than a cinematographer's eye, produced a monochrome view. Midnight arrived, stamped digitally. For several minutes, the frame was still life. Leaves holding their breath, fog glass and wandering reflections, a tiny skitter of insect wing across a lamp, then a change, subtle first, as if the camera's gamma had been nudged. A wavering brightening at the height of a man's chest, center of the orchid wing. It brightened past the camera's patience, blooming into a white patch that burned the sensor to flat gray. 6 seconds. Then the image subsided, leaving the same scene with one difference. The contrast had shifted. The glass caught light differently, as though something had been laid upon it, and the whole room agreed to a new way of being filmed. "No sparks," Arthur said quietly. "No origin point we can see. Airborne." He rewound, thumbed the jog forward, watched frame by frame. A faint prelude appeared 2 seconds before the bloom, an almost imperceptible ripple in a curtain of hanging tillandsia, motion without source. He froze it and leaned in. Draft, but not from a vent. Convection would move up. Duct air would move laterally. This pushes in, then out. He tapped the screen, as if a boundary opened and closed. Ellis shifted. "Sounds mad when you say it like that." "It sounds observed," Arthur said, not unkindly. Back in the greenhouse, Arthur paused at a junction where 4 aisles met. The floor tiles here were a mosaic of terracotta and black ceramic, their grout lines clean, a pride point for some unseen caretaker. He took a kneeling pad from his case and went to ground, eye level with the world that shoes ignore. On the grout near the orchid wing, he found a constellation of dots, minuscule droplets dried to crisp edge rings, their centers faintly blue. Micro-droplet deposition. An aerosol had settled and left its signature as solvent departed. He took a scalpel, lifted one ring's fragile crust, and slid it into a vial. Then he used a clear tape lift on a larger patch, the adhesive taking the whole tiny nebula in a single pull. He labeled it, floor, IOC 742. He stood and followed the pattern. The dots were densest between 2 benches and thinned as they tracked toward the center, where the reported flame had hovered, as if the air there had first gathered, then radiated. "What was in this section before last night?" he asked the curator. "Hybrid orchids. One-of-a-kinds from a grant project. We rotate public displays away from here. These are the delicate ones. Any with unusual fragrances? Solvents used in pollination or preservation? The lab logs solvents in the quarantine wing only. Here, it's distilled water, humidity, and patience." Arthur's pen moved again. Aerosol present. Blue film uniform at human height. Minimal thermal signature. Metallic odor, slight varnish note. Ozone spike. He looked up, his expression gone far away, where connections live. Something that ionized air locally. Something that threw a field, even briefly. And something that rode that field, a complex that deposits as a thin film and gives a blue persistence under UV. The curator blinked. "In English?" "In English," Arthur said, "someone released a very fine mist of a compound that likes to cling to glass and remembers light. The flame may have been chemiluminescence, light from a chemical reaction, or an optical effect if enough particles aligned in an electric field. Either way, less fire than performance." He paused. "But that doesn't account for the visions." "Gas," Ellis ventured, quietly, like them old stories of laughing ether. "Possibly an odorant with neural effects," Arthur said. "But your noses would have shouted. This metallic tang sits in the mouth, not the mind. I've smelled it near certain cobalt complexes, and those, under the right ligands, can play at phosphorescence." "Cobalt?" the curator repeated, uncertain if he should be impressed or alarmed. "Don't panic. Arthur said, not taking his eyes from the orchids. Cobalt lives in glass tints and dryer beads. It's the company it keeps that matters. He slipped his phone from his pocket and typed a single line to the only person who could see what he suspected as clearly as he could. Lily, bring the portable spectrograph and the Raman wand. And a gentle day. Conservatory. He hesitated, then added, there's a memory in the glass. He finished his circuit of the greenhouse with the efficiency of ritual. Air samples from 4 corners, tape lifts from the underside of panes where fewer fingers ventured, a swab from the inside of a ventilation grill, to see what the building had been breathing. In a shaded corner, he found a tiny square of translucent film clinging to a drain grate, the kind used to cover Petri dishes. He teased it up at the tip of a micro spatula. The film bore a thumbprint. Ridges clear. The ridges were blue. Arthur held it up to the light, watching the print bloom and fade under his UV torch, as if someone had left a ghost of themselves behind, too. He smiled without humor. Our visitor was not as careful as they thought. On his way out, he paused at the threshold and looked back. The glasshouse returned his gaze in 1,000 curving panes, each one carrying that faint, stubborn veil of blue. It was as if the room had been asked to remember one specific second of his long life, and had agreed. Sealed again, he told the curator. No cleaning, no fans, no heroic gardening. My colleague will be here within the hour. We'll listen to what your glass has to say. Outside, the morning had shifted toward day. The tram's hum grew bolder. Arthur closed his case and exhaled, tasting the metallic note lingering on the back of his tongue. A cobalt ghost in a garden of living color. A cold flame that burned without heat. Visions whispered into honest heads. He felt a familiar click behind his eyes as a pattern began to assemble, filaments reaching for a frame. He did not yet know the culprit or the mechanism, but he knew this. Whatever had bloomed at midnight was not an accident. It was an experiment, staged with an artist's sense of spectacle and a chemist's hand. And experiments, if you are patient, always leave enough truth behind to be found. Chapter 2, The Mirage Compound. Dr. Lili Kozar arrived just as the morning sun began to press its way through the glasshouse roof, scattering fractured beams across the humid air. Her lab coat, more suited for a university corridor than a botanical jungle, clung slightly in the warmth, and a portable spectrograph slung over her shoulder clicked faintly with each step. Arthur was crouched near the orchid section, peering into a vial that shimmered faintly under the low-angle light. He didn't look up when he said, "Careful where you step, Lily. The aerosol deposition's uneven here. I don't want your footprints in the sample field." She stopped mid-stride, arching an eyebrow. "You could start with good morning." He smiled faintly. "Good morning. Now, heel to toe along the central aisle. Stay on the grout lines." Lily obeyed, glancing at the benches of rare orchids sealed under bell jars. "The curator said you think we're looking at a cobalt complex." Arthur held up the vial, rotating it slowly. The pale blue haze clinging to its inner wall caught the light and winked like powdered gemstones. "I don't think. I know. The spectral fingerprint from my portable unit matches cobalt ions bound to an aromatic ligand. Likely something with extended conjugation, which would explain persistence of the glow under UV," she said, setting the spectrograph case down on the bench. "But not why it's in a botanical conservatory." "Exactly." He gestured for her to set up. "We'll start with Raman. The film's thin enough for surface analysis without destruction." Lily unpacked the sleek, wand-like instrument and powered it on. The soft hum of an internal laser filled the warm air as she adjusted the focus. Arthur moved aside, giving her a clear line to the glass pane he'd swabbed earlier but left untouched in one square patch. She guided the probe in slow arcs across the haze, the laptop linked to the device sketching jagged peaks in real time. After a few passes, she froze the screen. "There, see? Strong bands at 1620 and 1540 cm superscript 1, and a smaller one near 1480. Aromatic C equals C stretches." And here, she tapped a peak near 560 cm superscript 1. Metal, ligand vibration consistent with cobalt-nitrogen coordination. Arthur leaned in. So our mystery guest synthesized something purpose-built to bind cobalt in a photoreactive complex. Stable enough to aerosolize, fine enough to suspend in still air, and apparently benign in low doses. Benign, chemically, maybe, Lili said. But what about the visions? Arthur tapped the side of his head. Neuroactive coligands aren't impossible. If you tether a volatile amine to this complex, you could deliver something that alters perception. Short-lived, no residue in blood after a few hours. Lili frowned. That sounded more like theater than science. That, Arthur said, is my point. They moved methodically down the orchid bench, scanning and sampling. At one jar, Lili paused. This one's different. Look at the petals, dusted with the same haze. Arthur bent to see. The orchid's lip glistened faintly blue even in ambient light. Our source, perhaps? If someone dusted this flower deliberately, its slow transpiration could release the aerosol over hours. But why an orchid? Because it's beautiful, Arthur said simply. And because beauty makes people linger, breathe deeply, and drop their guard. Lili logged the specimen and sealed the jar. We'll need to run a full spectrum in the lab. Maybe GC, MS for the volatile components. Arthur straightened, looking out across the conservatory. The delivery system is clever, but the real question is intent. Was this meant as an art installation, an experiment, or something less innocent? Lili's gaze followed his. The blue haze was faint now, almost invisible in the growing daylight, but was everywhere, clinging like a memory that refused to fade. Whatever it was, she said quietly, it's not over. This compound's too deliberate to be a one-time stunt. Arthur nodded. Then we find its maker, and we start, he glanced again at the orchid under glass, with whoever supplied this plant. Chapter 3, Bloom of Deception. By midday, the blue haze had thinned almost to invisibility, dissolved into the Glasshouse's warm, moist air. But Arthur Langley had seen enough in the morning light to know where to look. The orchid section, an elegant display of rare hybrids behind brass railings, no longer seemed merely decorative. It was, in his eyes, an engineered stage. The curator stood nearby, his hands clasped as if to keep from touching anything. These orchids came from several sources, he said, answering Arthur's earlier question. Some from our in-house hybridization program, others from exchanges with private collectors. And 3, including the one you marked, Dr. Kozar, arrived just 2 weeks ago from a grower in Antwerp. Antwerp, Arthur repeated, his tone neutral, known for its diamonds, its art museums, and, occasionally, its botanical eccentricities. He crouched beside the sealed jar containing the suspect orchid. Its lip was a dense swirl of violet and white, with a subtle metallic shimmer that could be mistaken for natural iridescence. Dr. Lili Kozar had already set up a portable UV lamp, angling its violet beam over the petals. Under the glow, the shimmer ignited into a fine dusting of blue stars, each one a point of cobalt's stubborn memory. It's not surface contamination, she murmured. It's embedded in the waxy cuticle of the petals. Whoever introduced it didn't just dust this plant, they integrated it during cultivation. Arthur's eyes narrowed, which means the chemical was an afterthought. This plant was grown to carry it. Lili adjusted the lamp, and not for a greenhouse full of scientists. Look at the symmetry of the markings, the color contrast. It's ornamental theater. This is meant to seduce the eye before it works on the mind. The curator shifted uneasily. Are you suggesting this is deliberate sabotage? A biohazard? Arthur rose to his full height. Not a hazard in the traditional sense, but a weapon in the right setting. Yes, controlled doses, carefully timed release. You could make a room full of people see whatever you wanted them to see, long enough to influence them or distract them. Lili pulled a thin scalpel from her kit and gently scraped the petal's surface into a vial. The dust settled like ground sapphire. "We'll confirm the ligand structure in the lab," she said, sealing the sample. "But from the Raman data, I'd wager it's a pyridal complex, stable, luminescent, and with binding sites that could carry psychoactive molecules." Arthur glanced toward the other 2 orchids from Antwerp. "Test them all. If each one's dosed, our grower isn't just a supplier, they're part of performance." As they moved along the bench, Arthur kept one ear on the conservatory sounds. The gentle hiss of misting nozzles, the creak of settling glass, the low murmur of the curator speaking with Ellis near the door. It was in that hush that he heard something else, the faintest chime, like a wine glass rung by a fingertip. He froze, tilting his head. "Lili," he said quietly, "do you hear that?" She paused mid-sample. "A high tone?" "Yes." "Not electrical?" "No," Arthur said. "Acoustic. Resonant." He traced the sound to the far end of the orchid section, where a small, locked display case held miniature species, tiny blooms no bigger than coins. The chime came again, this time as a subtle harmonic rippled through the glass. He knelt, examining the lock. It was old brass and scratched in a way that suggested recent use. "Curator," he called. "Who else has keys to this case?" "Only myself, Ellis, and Miss Fenton, our horticulture lead," the man replied. Arthur nodded, withdrawing a slim metal probe from his case. He inserted it into the narrow space between the door and frame, flicking a fragment of blue powder from the inner edge. He held it up for Lili to see. "Same compound," she said without hesitation. Arthur's expression darkened. Then the performance wasn't limited to a single bloom. Someone scattered the stage with multiple cues, each one ready to release at the right trigger. The curator swallowed. "Trigger?" Arthur looked back at the miniature orchids, the faint chime still whispering. Pressure, light, humidity, or sound. In the hands of someone who knows how to play a room, it's as precise as any chemical timer. Lili straightened, her sample vials clinking faintly. "And if this is theater, Arthur, the show hasn't ended. It's only an intermission." Arthur closed the display case with deliberate care. "Then let's make sure Act 2 plays on our terms." Chapter 4. The Painter in the Shadows. The curator's office was a cramped space above the conservatory's main entrance, its tall windows warped by decades of sun and condensation. Folders and plant catalogs crowded the shelves. The air smelled faintly of pressed flowers and old glue. Arthur Langley stood by the window, scanning a sheaf of shipping documents the curator had just handed him. Dr. Lili Kozar perched on the edge of the desk, her laptop balanced on one knee, fingers flicking through her own search results. The Antwerp shipment invoice was innocuous at first glance. Botanical Latin shipment codes, a neat customs decoration. But one name stood out, Victor Renn, listed not as a grower, but as artistic consultant. Arthur tapped the page. Why would a botanical shipment require an artistic consultant? The curator adjusted his tie nervously. Victor Renn is, well, he's a well-known installation artist. He's done exhibitions in Berlin, Kyoto, New York. Large-scale, immersive environments. Sometimes works with botanicals. Lili looked up. You mean he designs rooms that make you feel something the moment you step inside? Arthur's mouth quirked. Precisely the skill set you'd want for a spectacle involving psychoactive cobalt compounds. The curator hesitated. We did invite him, indirectly. Ms. Fenton, our horticulture lead, attended one of his private shows last year. Said it was like walking into someone else's dream. A month later, she proposed commissioning him to reimagine part of our orchid collection for the spring gala. Arthur set the papers down, his expression unreadable. When was the last time he visited? 2 weeks ago, the day the Antwerp orchids arrived. He and Ms. Fenton spent the afternoon here, behind closed doors in the orchid wing. Lili's gaze sharpened. And now we have plants laced with a cobalt-based Mirage compound, timed to release under certain conditions. That's not a coincidence. Arthur moved to the wall, where a series of black and white photographs were tacked, shots of past exhibitions. One, labeled Victor Renn, 2019, caught his eye. The image showed a gallery space filled with translucent panels, each glowing faintly with drifting pigments. In the center, a pedestal supported a single glass sphere, lit from within by a cold, steady blue. Arthur tapped the sphere. He's used this palette before. Blue as his signature. And blue is what Cobalt loves to give. The curator cleared his throat. If you think Renn's responsible, he's not easy to find. He works under aliases, moves constantly. No fixed studio. Arthur turned to Lili. What about his materials? If he's aerosolizing a cobalt complex, it has to be synthesized somewhere. Antwerp has labs, but customs would know any unusual reagent shipments. Lili's fingers flew across her keyboard. I'll pull recent import manifest flag for cobalt salts and organic ligands. If we're lucky, he's careless enough to buy directly. She paused. Or arrogant enough to leave a trail on purpose. Arrogant artists often believe their process is part performance, Arthur said. They won't be found by the right audience. From below, the conservatory's iron staircase groaned under approaching footsteps. A woman appeared in the doorway, a tall figure in a green work jacket, her hands smudged with soil. She looked between Arthur and Lili, then at the curator. You called for me? Ms. Fenton, the curator said quickly. This is Arthur Langley and Dr. Lili Kozar. They're investigating the incident last night. Her gaze lingered on Arthur. Incident? I'd call it a rare bloom in full glory. Shame I missed it. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. Missed it? You were here the day the orchids arrived. You worked with Renn directly. And yet you weren't present during conservatory's midnight moment? Ms. Fenton shrugged. I left before closing. I'm not paid for night shifts. Her tone was light, but her hands tightened slightly on the strap of her bag. Arthur noted the faint dusting of blue along the cuff of her jacket. Not much, just enough to catch the light, if you knew to look. I imagine Renn leaves quite an impression, he said. A flicker, just a heartbeat, passed over her expression. Amusement? Annoyance? It vanished as she replied. Artists like him don't leave impressions. They plant ideas. The rest is your own mind doing the work. Arthur let the silence stretch before saying, We'll need a list of everyone with access to the orchid section in the past month. And I'd like to see Renn propose designs for your gala. She smiled faintly. If I can find them. He's not one for paperwork. Arthur stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for her to lean in. If he's behind last night's display, Miss Fenton, you're already in his performance. And performances like his rarely end where you think they do. Her smile held, but her eyes shifted, calculating. She nodded once, then left without another word. Lili broke the silence. She's involved. Arthur picked up the cobalt-dusted cufflink from his field case, a relic from another investigation, and turned it in his fingers. Perhaps, or perhaps she's just another actor in Renn's shadow play. Either way, the next scene will not be here. He glanced at the curator. I'll need the address where Renn's last payment was sent, and a quiet driver. Lili closed her laptop. We're going hunting for the painter in the shadows? Arthur's gaze was steady. No, we're going to see what happens when you shine a light on him. Chapter 5, Vanishing Visions. The address in the curator's files led Arthur and Lili to a disused tram depot on the city's east side, a cavernous brick structure whose arched windows were boarded over, save for a single pane that glowed faintly blue in the afternoon light. The place had the silence of something waiting to be used again, but on different terms. They entered through a side door, Arthur's gloved hand pushing past the work frame. Inside, dust motes spun lazily in the filtered light, and the vast floor was littered with crates, metal scaffolding, and rolled canvases stacked like fallen columns. At the far end, a makeshift studio had been assembled. Easels, industrial fans, racks of glass panels leaning against the wall. Lili moved first toward the racks. Look at this, she murmured, sliding one of the panels into the light. Embedded in its surface were delicate whorls of cobalt dust, arranged in patterns that mimicked flower petals. Same compound, the exact same signature from the conservatory samples. Arthur studied the floor. A faint trail of blue specks led away from the panels, crossing the concrete toward a smaller room partitioned off with black curtains. From behind them came a soft, rhythmic sound. A chime, almost identical to the one they'd heard among the miniature orchids. They exchanged a glance. Arthur pulled the curtain aside. The room beyond was dark, save for a single spotlight on a suspended glass sphere. Inside the sphere, a swirling cobalt haze coiled and twisted like smoke in slow motion. The sphere pulsed gently, and each pulse seemed to send a chime through the air, not loud, but perfectly pitched to catch the inner ear. Arthur circled it once, careful not to break the rhythm of the haze. A dispersal device, he said softly, elegant, timed, and tuned to a resonant frequency. Trigger the chime, and the aerosol releases. From the shadows, a voice spoke. You make it sound so mechanical. And here I thought I was creating a living memory. Victor Renn emerged in the dark, dressed in a loose charcoal coat, his hands stained faintly blue. His eyes flicked between Arthur and Lili, appraising them like subjects in a half-finished portrait. Arthur straightened. You embedded cobalt complexes in living orchids. You timed the release for the exact humidity and light conditions of conservatory, and you dosed the air with something that altered perception. Why? Renn smiled faintly. Because the city is blind. I give it visions. 6 seconds in which the ordinary dissolves. A glimpse of beauty beyond reason, unmediated, unearned, unforgettable. Lili's tone was sharper. And you never consider the consequences. Disorientation, panic, medical complications, collateral discomfort, Renn said, brushing the air with one hand. All art exact a price. Arthur's gaze hardened. You're mistaken. This isn't art. It's control. Renn tilted his head. Control? No, Mr. Langley. It's liberation. I removed the barriers in people's minds, if only for a moment. You of all people should appreciate the chemistry of revelation. Arthur stepped closer, his voice low. I appreciate consent. You stole it from everyone who breathed your haze. For a moment, the three of them stood in a tense triangle, the sphere's glow pulsing between them. Then Renn's smile returned. You didn't come here just to scold me. You came to see if you could stop me. But the next performance, he gestured toward a stack of crates marked with the conservatory's gala date, is already sold out. Arthur glanced at Lili, a silent calculation passing between them. Then he said, We'll see about that. That night, back at the conservatory, Arthur and Lili set the trap. The gala space was prepared exactly as Renn's designs dictated. The orchids in place, the lighting tuned, the humidity controls set to trigger the dispersal. Security cameras were hidden at multiple angles, their feeds routed to a sealed control room. At precisely 9 o'clock, Renn arrived, flanked by 2 assistants carrying sealed cases. He moved like a conductor approaching his orchestra, pausing only to adjust the placement of a bell jar or angle a light just so. Guests began to drift into the space, hand-picked by the curator to keep the crowd small and easily managed. As Renn took his position near the miniature orchids, Arthur gave a discreet nod to Lili. She flicked a hidden switch, and the room's air circulation shifted almost imperceptibly, reversing the flow. The chime began. The guests stilled. The first tendrils of cobalt haze lifted into the air, and then, just as Renn opened his mouth to speak, the haze curled back, sucked silently into concealed vents and into sealed capture canisters waiting in the control room. Renn froze, his performance unraveling in silence. Arthur stepped forward into the light. Your visions, he said quietly, seemed to vanish without their stage. Renn's eyes narrowed. You're interfering with the audience's experience. Arthur's expression didn't change. I'm preserving their choice. Security closed in. The captured haze and the evidence it carried would tell the rest of the story. Renn, for all his talk of liberation, was simply another manipulator hiding behind beauty. As the guests murmured, confused but unharmed, Arthur watched the last traces of blue fade from the orchids. For the first time in days, the conservatory air felt clean. Chapter 6. The Final Spectrum. The lab was quiet except for the gentle hum of instruments and the occasional clink of glassware. In the center of the main bench, 3 sealed capture canisters from the conservatory's gala trap sat like relics. Each one held the cobalt haze that Victor Renn had intended for his audience, siphoned away before it could do its work. Dr. Lili Kozar moved with methodical precision, transferring samples into the GC-MS inlet, while Arthur Langley documented every step in his meticulous script. First pass shows what we expected, Lili said, eyes on the computer screen as the chromatogram unfolded. Cobalt coordinated to a bipyridyl ligand, stable, luminescent, resistant to hydrolysis. It's elegant chemistry. Arthur, someone wanted this compound to survive in the air for hours without degrading. Arthur leaned on the bench, scanning the peaks. What about the coligands? Anything volatile enough to explain the visions? Lili's fingers danced over the keyboard, isolating a cluster of peaks in the low-mass range. Here, a substituted indole, structurally similar to certain neurotransmitter analogs. Non-lethal in micrograms, but potent enough to cause altered perception, time distortion, even mild euphoria. The cobalt complex was just a delivery vehicle. Arthur's brow furrowed. And the blue haze? A visual lure to mask the true payload. Exactly. Lili switched to the Raman data from the orchid petals, overlaying it with the aerosol sample. The spectra matched perfectly. He grew the vector into the plants themselves. They transpired the compound into the air the moment humidity and light hit the right balance. Arthur's pen tapped against his notebook. So Renn's art was a controlled neurochemical event. He wasn't just making people see. He was making them feel exactly what he wanted. A 6-second emotional hijack. Lili looked up from the monitor. He probably justified it as expanding perception. But the chemistry doesn't care about intent. Arthur crossed the spectrograph set up against the far wall, where thin glass slides held traces of the blue film collected from the conservatory glass. Under magnification, the particles resolved into microscopic crystalline lattices, delicate, symmetrical, almost beautiful. He adjusted the focus until the cobalt signature wavelength filled the display, a pure band of blue-green that pulsed like a steady heartbeat. The final spectrum, Arthur murmured, the truth in its purest form. No illusions, no visions, just a mechanism. Lili joined him, her expression unreadable. You almost admire it. I admire precision, Arthur said. But precision used without consent is just another form of violence. They began packing the evidence for transfer to the city's forensic archives. The aerosol samples would be neutralized, the orchids quarantined and stripped of their engineered payload. The conservatory would open again within the week, minus the midnight flames and cobalt ghosts. As they worked, Arthur's phone buzzed. A message from the curator. Renn refused a deal. He calls you the thief of dreams. Arthur allowed himself the faintest of smiles. If that's what it takes to keep the city awake, I'll wear the title. By evening, the lab was clean, the evidence locked away. Outside, the late sun turned the sky to molten copper. Arthur paused at the door, the fading light glinting off his glasses. We caught him this time, he said quietly, but there will be others. There are always others who think beauty justifies a means. Lili locked the last case. Then we'll keep reminding them it doesn't. They stepped out into the cooling air, leaving the hum of the lab behind. Somewhere beyond the skyline, the first stars were beginning to show distant points of light that asked for nothing, gave only what they were. Epilogue, a garden restored. The conservatory reopened on a quiet Thursday morning. There was no fanfare, no grand announcement, just a steady return of footsteps on the gravel paths and the soft click of the wrought iron gates. The air inside was warm and clean, carrying only the honest scent of soil, leaves, and flowers. The orchids from Antwerp were gone, replaced with species from the garden's own collections. No blue haze clung to the glass. No metallic tang lingered in the breath. The bell jars shone clear under the filtered sunlight, and the only sounds were the rustle of palm fronds and the occasional call of a bird in the nearby aviary. Arthur Langley stood near the entrance, his hands folded loosely behind his back, watching as a group of school children press their faces to glass to admire a rare butterfly orchid. Their voices were full of simple wonder, the kind that needed no chemical persuasion. Dr. Lili Kozar approached, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. "You could almost forget what happened here," she said, passing him one. Arthur took the cup, but didn't drink. Forgetting is easy. Remembering is what keeps the garden safe. They walked together along the central aisle, past benches where seedlings stretched toward the light. Workers moved quietly, tending plants with the gentle focus of those who understood their fragility. Near the orchid wing, the curator paused his work to nod at them. "Everything's back to normal," he said, though there was a trace of relief in his voice. "No midnight flames. No visions." Arthur gave a faint smile. "The garden has its own magic. It doesn't need anyone else's." Outside, the early spring air was crisp, the sky washed clean by a morning rain. As they reached the gates, Arthur glanced back at the Glasshouse. In the sunlight, its curved roof glimmered, not with cobalt haze, but with the simple reflection of the day. Lily followed his gaze. "Do you think Renn will try again?" Arthur sipped his tea, eyes on the bright glass. "Artists like him always do. But beauty isn't dangerous until someone decides to own it. When they do, we'll be here." They stepped out onto the cobbled street, the sound of the gates closing behind them like the final note of a resolved chord. Ahead, the city stretched into the distance, alive, imperfect, and entirely real. And somewhere in its quiet heart, a garden breathed easy again. Thank you for wandering through the quiet corridors of night chemistry. May the questions of the day dissolve like salt in still water, and may peaceful dreams form their own gentle equations. Until our next nocturnal experiment, sleep well and good night.